welcome. This is step 3 of the 10-step series, how to take compelling images and avoid some of the costly mistakes that I have made over the years and shorten your learning curve. Today we're going to talk about understanding the water column. One of the obstacles in underwater photography is that we're dealing with water, okay? One of the things is focusing on your subject. Sometimes, it's easy to understand that the subject, the fish, might be moving. Well, we might be used to topside taking pictures of things that are moving. That's one thing. But the other is that we're often moving. We're kicking, there's buoyancy, there's surge, and sometimes we have a hard time holding still, and that makes it difficult to focus on the subject, especially for macro, when you really do need to be focused because there's very little depth of field. So here's a picture of an eel that I just could not focus on. The eel was moving. However, if we can hold still, have good buoyancy, put our hand on an adjacent rock or ledge to stabilize ourselves, and wait until I find something that's relatively still, we can sometimes able to focus and snap a clear picture. Another thing, with a wide-angle lens, that has much better depth of field. So if we're relatively shallow, we still want a fairly quick shutter speed to stop the action, but it's much easier to focus with a wide-angle lens because there's much more that's going to be in focus. Other things we can do to overcome this obstacle is get a camera with quick autofocus, all right? Let's move on. Another problem with the water column is light does not pass nearly so well in water as it does in air. So water degrades color, contrast, and clarity. Here's a picture of what I thought would be beautiful. It's a nurse shark, and very, very poor contrast and color. The water column degraded this. Here's another shot. I was close to this subject, but it was in about 50, 60 feet of water. So even though I was close to this beautiful red parrotfish, you can't see the colors. The colors are gone. By about 10 to 15 feet, the color red is lost from the water column, all right? And by about 50 or 60 feet, all you see are green and blue. The water column is two things. It's not just how far away your camera is from the subject, but it's also how deep you are. So if you're 20 feet deep and 5 feet away from the subject, the water column's 25 feet. So this water column is what degrades color, contrast, and clarity. Also, the water column takes away light. So in order to get proper lighting and exposure, your shutter has to be open a longer period of time. And with a slower shutter speed, you're going to have more blurred from either the subject moving or from you moving a little bit. So here I was actually focused on this green moray eel, but my shutter speed was slow, and I got blurred from the subject moving and or from me moving. So the water column affects color, contrast, and clarity because of the long shutter speed. Now, how can we rectify this? Well, we could open our aperture, but now we're losing depth of field. We could bump up our ISO, but now we're degrading our quality a little bit. We can't really slow our shutter speed because now we're going to get back to problems with blur from motion blur. And on the top of all this, none of these things will restore color. So there's two main ways to solve this problem. One, reduce the water column. Stay shallow and get close to the subject. So here's a picture, beautiful picture, all right, of a nice red sea urchin with a wide-angle lens. I was close to the subject. I had a quick shutter speed, good depth of field with my wide-angle lens. I was able to focus on it. I got colors, clarity, and contrast. Another thing, this is a filefish, but I was close to it, but at 50 feet, again, we lose the color. So the other thing we can do to solve this, in addition to reducing the water column, the other thing we can do is use a strobe. The strobe will restore color, contrast, and clarity, even at depth. As you see with that other fish and with these beautiful purple coral. Okay, now strobes introduce their own set of problems, and we're going to talk about this more in the strobe tutorial. But briefly, strobes have a limited ability to penetrate underwater. So here I'm about 5 or 6 feet away. The strobe didn't really penetrate, it's washed out. You can have too much or too little strobe power. You have to look at your histogram to look at your exposure, and you can adjust your strobe power or the strobe to subject distance to get adequate exposure. Strobes also can have problems with light traps. You might have a distracting background or foreground, as in this picture. So we have to understand the cone of light and understand how to position our strobes and compose our pictures. And strobes can also cause backscatter. When all the little suspended particles in the water, when you illuminate them, it looks pretty awful. It looks like the subject is in a blizzard. Now, you can remove a few of them in Photoshop, but I don't have 30 minutes to remove all this backscatter in every one of my pictures. Also, strobes don't have good access. I was taking pictures of this eel. Wow, this is going to be great, this is going to be great, but my strobe was up here, the eel was down here, and I only illuminated the tip of his nose. So we need to understand the cone of light and strobe positioning. And we'll talk about that more in the strobe tutorial. But the point is, when you use a strobe, you can restore color, contrast, and clarity and come up with beautiful pictures. So, understanding the water column. The water column, there's problems with blurred, difficulty focusing because of movement of yourself and the subject. And then there's problems with the way the water column reduces light, color, contrast, and clarity. So we can solve these problems by reducing the water column, staying shallow and getting close to our subject, and also bringing a strobe into the picture. All right, thank you. This concludes step 3 of the series.